I'm going to read this article called The Samurai, Protectors of the Cow. It's from indiadivine.org. This is really an interesting, amazing article about the chronological history of Japan and their love for the cow. If I were to tell you that once no other country save India revered the cow as much as Japan, I could understand your disbelief. Today we think of Japan as a meat-eating culture. However, this image is a product of the last 150 years of American influence. The traditional Japanese culture held the cow as the most sacred animal. What follows next is a true story of among the greatest protectors of the cow, the samurai. In the footsteps of the Buddha. When Buddhism left India for the Far East, it had a profound influence on all of the countries it encountered, including China, Korea, and Japan. Buddhism entered Japan around the year 552 AD. In April 675 AD, the Japanese Emperor Tenmu banned the consumption of all meat from four-legged animals, including cows, horses, dogs, and monkeys, as well as domestic birds such as chickens and roosters. Each succeeding emperor would periodically reinforce this ban until by the 10th century all meat eating had been eliminated. In mainland China and Korea, the Buddhist monks adhered to the principle of ahimsa, or nonviolence, in their eating habits. But these strictures were not placed on the population as a whole. In Japan, however, the emperor was very strict in guiding his subjects towards the Buddha's teachings of nonviolence. The killing of mammals was considered extremely sinful, birds moderately sinful, and fish somewhat sinful. The Japanese did eat whale, which today we know are mammals, but at the time were considered very large fish. The Japanese also made a distinction between animals reared in the household and wild animals. To kill a wild animal such as a bird was sinful. However, to kill an animal raised from birth was considered abominable, tantamount to killing a member of the family. As such, the diet of the Japanese was mostly rice, noodles, fish, and on occasion wildfowl. During the Heian period, 794 to 1185 AD, the Engshiki, a book of law and customs, required a period of fasting for up to 3 days as penance for eating meat. During this period of penance, one was not to look at the deities of the Buddha as a sign of shame. In subsequent centuries, for the Ise shrine, passed even stricter rules. One who ate meat must fast for 100 days, while one who ate with someone who ate meat must fast for 21 days, and one who ate with someone who ate with someone that ate meat must fast for 7 days. In this way, 3 layers of pollution were accounted for through penance due to the violence inherent in meat. To the Japanese, the cow was the most sacred animal. The drinking of milk, however, was not common in Japan. Among the peasantry, the cow was used almost exclusively as a draft animal to plow the fields. Among the aristocracy, there is some evidence of milk consumption. There were instances where cream and butter were used for the payment of taxes. However, for the most part, cows were protected for their own sake and allowed to roam around the royal gardens at peace. One milk product we know the Japanese used was called daigo. The modern Japanese word daigomi, meaning the very best part, is derived from this milk product. It is meant to evoke the feeling of deep flavor and pleasure. Symbolically, it was seen as the final stage of purification towards enlightenment. The first mention of daigo is found in the Nirvana Sutra with the following recipe. From cows to fresh milk to cream, cream to curdled milk to butter, butter to ghee. Daigo. Daigo is the best. Nirvana Sutra. Another milk product was raku, said to be made from sugar mixed with milk, boiled down until it became a hard block. Some say it was a type of cheese, but from its description it sounds like a form of burfi. In an age before refrigeration, this enabled the transport and preservation of milk protein. Shavings of raku were sold and either eaten or added to hot tea. The foreign arrivals. On August 15, 1549, Francis Xavier, one of the founders of the Jesuit Catholic order, along with Portuguese missionaries, arrived on the shores of Nagasaki, Japan. They began to preach their Christian faith. Japan at this time was politically divided. Many individual lords ruled over territories, and various alliances and wars were taking place. One samurai, Oda Nobunaga, though born of peasants, would go on to become one of the three great unifiers of Japan. He was also notable for giving accommodation to the Jesuits for their preaching and supported the establishment of the first Christian church in Kyoto in 1576. Many believe his support was a way to undermine the power of the Buddhist priests. Initially, the Jesuits were cautious observers. In Japan, they found an alien culture that was highly refined and developed. They noted that the Japanese were obsessed by cleanliness, bathing every day. This was unusual at a time when Europeans would bathe only once every few months, if at all. The Japanese also wrote from top to bottom rather than left to right, and while they had a strong military order in the samurai, they still fought with swords and arrows. The King of Portugal did not financially support the missionary activities in Japan. Instead, the Jesuits were allowed to engage in trade. After converting the local daimyo, Lord Omura Sumitada, the small fishing village of Nagasaki was given to the Jesuits. In time, Christian missionaries found favor throughout southern Japan and converted the daimyos of Kyushu and Yamaguchi regions. All manner of trade began to flow through Nagasaki, and merchants were becoming very wealthy. There was particular interest in Portuguese guns. However, as the missionaries expanded, they began to introduce meat eating. At first, it was an accommodation for the foreign missionaries who needed meat to be healthy, quote unquote. But the slaughter of animals and the consumption of meat spread wherever people converted to the new faith. We see this evident in the Japanese world. In the Japanese word for meat, waka, derived from the Portuguese vaca. There was one social class called eta, literal translation is an abundance of filth, that were considered unclean as their occupation was to dispose of dead carcasses. Today they are known as burukumun. No cow was ever to be killed. However, they were allowed to make and sell leather goods from a cow that died of natural causes. Because they were engaged in unclean activities, at the bottom of the social ladder, many converted and were engaged in the growing meat industry. But the spread of meat eating was only the beginning. The Portuguese were one of the main merchants of world slavery at the time. The Jesuits facilitated this slave trade through their port city of Nagasaki. This became known as the Nanban, or Southern Barbarian Trade. Thousands of Japanese women were enslaved and brutalized around the world. There was in fact correspondence between the King of Portugal, João III, and the Pope listing the price for this exotic fare: 50 Japanese girls for 1 barrel of Jesuit saltpeter, gunpowder. As local lords were converted, many forced their subjects to convert as well. The Jesuits saw weapons trade as one means to shift the balance of political power between the various warring sides. They supplied arms to Christian daimyo and used their own military forces to advance their influence. Many lords would convert knowing they would gain military advantage over their rivals. Within a few decades, it is estimated there were over 300,000 converts. Caution was now replaced by confidence. Ancient Buddhist temples and shrines were now being desecrated as pagan and unholy. Observing all of this was the samurai Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Like his master Oda Nobunaga, he too was born a peasant and grew to become a powerful general. He became suspicious of Jesuit motives when he saw the Spanish conquer the Philippines. What he saw happening in Japan made him disgusted. In 1587, General Hideyoshi commanded the Jesuit priest Gaspar Coelho to meet and handed him the Purge Directive Order of the Jesuits. In this document were 11 points. Among them, number 1, all Japanese slave trade must end and all Japanese women from around the world must be returned. Number 2, all meat eating must cease. The cow and horse must never be killed. Number 3, all desecration of Buddhist temples must end. Number 4, all first conversion must end. With that, he expelled the Jesuits from Japan. It had been only 38 years since their arrival. Next, he led his armies through the southern barbarian lands. Conquering these lands, he was disgusted by the slaughtered carcasses that lined the street shops. He began to post Kosatsu signboards all along the countryside notifying the people of the laws and ordinances of the samurai. Among these laws, do not eat meat. Meat was no longer simply sinful and unclean. Now meat was associated with the wickedness of the foreign barbarian, with sexual slavery, religious desecration, and political subversion. Following the death of Hideyoshi in 1598, the samurai Tokugawa gained control. He also saw Christian missionary activities as a sort of expeditionary force to conquer Japan. By 1614, he banned Christianity entirely, noting they were corrupting goodness and creating political division. During the following decades, it is estimated that perhaps 3,000 Christians were killed, with most renouncing their faith or remaining hidden. Finally, the Sokoku Closed Country Edict of 1635 sealed off Japan to foreign influence. No Japanese were allowed to leave Japan nor return if they were abroad. Japanese trading boats were set on fire to sink off the coast. Foreigners were expelled, and only a very limited amount of trade was allowed through the tiny peninsula of Dejima in the Bay of Nagasaki. This island was 120 meters by 75 meters, and only 19 foreigners at any one time were allowed to be on this island. For the next 218 years, Japan remained isolated but politically stable. With no wars to fight, the samurai slowly became idle, interested mainly in the latest political gossip. While the society was controlled, some would say repressed, these restrictions allowed Japan to retain its traditional culture. The barbarians return. On July 8, 1853, Commodore Perry entered the Bay of Edo, the capital city, with 4 American warships puffing black smoke. They blockaded the bay and prevented any food or supplies from entering the country. The Japanese, isolated for the prior 218 years, were technologically far behind and were no match for the modern American ships. This became known as the Black Sails event. The Japanese were panicked, and this created a serious political crisis. Commodore Perry, on behalf of the United States, demanded Japan sign a treaty opening up for free trade. He began to fire his cannons as a show of force and threatened total destruction if they did not submit. On March 31, 1854, the Kanagawa Treaty, Japan-U.S. Treaty of Peace and Amity, was signed. Soon thereafter, the English, Dutch, and Russians followed suit, using similar strong-arm tactics to force their way into free trade with Japan. The Japanese realized their vulnerability and concluded they needed to modernize. One small Buddhist temple named Gokushin-ji was set aside to host the foreign visitors. By 1856, this temple was converted into the first U.S. consulate in Japan, headed by Consul General Townsend Harris. For 1,200 years, not a single cow had been killed in Japan. Then, in 1856, U.S. Consul General Townsend Harris had a cow brought to the consulate and slaughtered on the grounds of the temple. Then he, along with his interpreter Hendrik Huchsen, roasted and consumed the meat along with some wine. This caused great disturbance in the community, and farmers began to hide their cows in fear. Eventually, Huchsen was killed by a ronin, a samurai with no master, leading anti-foreigner campaigns. But the act was done. They had killed the most sacred animal to the Japanese. It was this act that was said to inaugurate modern Japan. Suddenly, old conventions were out, and the Japanese could shed their primitive and backward ways. In 1931, the consulate building was renamed the Temple of the Slaughtered Cow. To memorialize this event, a statue of the Buddha on top a pedestal decorated with cows overlooks the building. From then on, slaughterhouses started to appear, and wherever they opened, panic arose. The Japanese felt it desecrated their neighborhood, made it unclean and inauspicious. By 1869, the Japanese Ministry of Finance established the Gyuba Kaisha, a company designed to sell beef to foreign traders. Then in 1872, Emperor Meiji passed the Nikujiki Saiti law, which broke the 2 great strictures for Japanese Buddhist monks. It allowed them to get married and eat beef. Following that, in the same year, the emperor publicly announced that he personally loved to eat beef and mutton. On February 18, 1872, 10 Buddhist monks stormed the imperial palace to assassinate the emperor. 5 of the monks were shot and killed. They declared that eating meat was destroying the soul of the Japanese people and must be stopped. This news was suppressed in Japan but was reported in a British newspaper, The Times. The emperor then disbanded the samurai warrior class, replaced them with a Western-style conscripted military, and started purchasing modern weapons from the United States and Europe. Many samurai became impoverished overnight. They were now in a lower standing than the merchant class who were profiting through new trade. Marketing meat in Japan. With the emperor publicly declaring his love for meat, the intellectual, political, and economic classes began to embrace it. Intellectually, meat was promoted as a sign of civilization and modernity. Politically, meat was seen as a way to build up the strength of the military, to build a stronger soldier. Economically, meat was associated with affluence and wealth for the merchant class through trade. But the general public still regarded meat as unclean and sinful. A process to market meat to the public began. One technique was to rename the meat so as to avoid knowing what it was. For instance, boar was called botan, peony flower, deer as momiji, maple, and a horse as sakura, cherry blossom. We see a similar marketing approach today with Happy Meals, McNuggets, and Whoppers, whimsical names to hide the violence. One meat company in 1871 ran this advertisement pitch for their meat. First of all, a common excuse for disliking meat is that since cows and pigs are so big, butchering them is unbearable. Which is bigger, a cow or a whale? No one is against the eating of whale meat. It is cruel to kill a living creature. Is it not cruel to slice open the spine of a live eel or to cut the head off a live turtle? Are beef and cow's milk unclean? Cows and sheep eat only grains and grasses, while the boiled fish paste round in nihobashi is made from sharks they have feasted on drowning people. Although soup made from black porgy, a marine fish common in Asia, is delicious, it is made from a fish that eats the human excrement discarded from ships. And while spring greens are certainly fragrant and delicious, I expect that the urine applied as fertilizer to the plants the day before yesterday has soaked in the leaves completely. Does beef and milk smell bad? Don't pickled fish organs also smell bad? The fermented and dried jackfish meat certainly smells much worse. And what of the pickled eggplant and Dalton radish, made using the method introduced by our ancestors, by which insect larvae are combined with the rice miso used to pickle them? Isn't the issue based more upon what we are used to and not used to? Beef and milk provide a great deal of nourishment and are extremely good for the body. They are basic ingredients of Westerners. We Japanese must open our eyes and begin to receive the benefits to be had from beef and milk. Slowly the public began to turn, the paradigm shift. The cycle of destruction. The coming decades saw Japan develop a modernized military with expansionist dreams. Meat became a staple of the Japanese soldier's diet. While the scope of the subsequent wars is too great for this article, we can say Japan went on to commit great atrocities across Southeast Asia. As the war was coming to a close, the United States, once weapons supplier to Japan, was putting the finishing touches on the world's most destructive weapon. On July 16, 1945, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first atomic weapon, codenamed Trinity, was detonated. The father of the atomic bomb, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, upon seeing the results, thought of the Bhagavad Gita verse 1132, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." You can see him commenting on this verse below. The U.S. military then set their sights on Japan. Most of the sites in Japan had already been decimated by years of war. President Truman decided on two targets, Hiroshima and Kokura. These were standing cities unharmed thus far by the war. By dropping the weapon upon these targets, they could gain valuable testing of the effects on buildings and humans while breaking the will of the Japanese people. 3 weeks later, on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy, a uranium bomb, on the southern city of Hiroshima. Some 80,000 people were killed instantly, with another 70,000 injured and dying over the subsequent weeks. The next target was the city of Kokura, but a typhoon rolled in, delaying the flight. When the weather cleared on August 9, 1945, the plane, blessed by two priests, was loaded with Fat Man, a plutonium-based implosion weapon. It took off from Tinian Island, codenamed Papacy, with orders to drop the weapon on the city of Kokura only on a visual sight. The pilot, Major Charles Sweeney, flew over Kokura, but the city could not be seen due to cloud cover. He passed over and flew around for a second attempt, but still could not see the city. Running low on gas and flying over enemy territory, he made his third and final attempt. Again, the clouds made it impossible to make visual sight of the target. He flew on prepared to head back to base. Then the clouds parted and Major Sweeney could see the city of Nagasaki. With visual sight on target, he ordered the bomb dropped. It fell into the Urakami Valley of Nagasaki, and with a flash as hot as the sun, over 40,000 people were instantly killed. Far more would have died, but the walls of the valley protected much of the exterior city. Two of the greatest war crimes in their history had just been perpetrated. The old and the young, men, women, children, the healthy and the infirmed, all were killed. No mercy was shown. The phrase, "the luck of Kokura," came to mean escaping unaware, complete destruction. When news came back that Nagasaki was destroyed, the two priests that blessed the plane were in shock. Both Father George Zabelka and William Downey, a Catholic and a Lutheran, would later renounce all forms of violence. You see, Nagasaki was the center of Christianity in Japan, and the Urakami Valley was the center of Christianity in Nagasaki. Almost 396 years to the day that Francis Xavier first arrived in Nagasaki, fellow Christians killed more members of their faith than any samurai ever did over 200 years of persecution. Later, two U.S. Catholic bishops, John O'Hara and Michael Reedy, were urged by General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied Supreme Commander, to send thousands of Catholic missionaries at once, for they only had about 1 year to fill the spiritual vacuum created by the defeat. The aftermath in modern Japan. The Japanese were completely destroyed. On September 2, 1945, they officially surrendered. During the U.S. occupation, 1945 to 1952, the Allied Supreme Commander established a school lunch program managed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in order to improve the health of Japanese schoolchildren and teach them an acquired taste for meat. Initially, 250,000 children participated, which increased to 8 million by the end of the occupation. But a mysterious disease began to infect the schoolchildren. Some feared it was due to residual radiation from the atomic weapons. Rashes started to appear all over their bodies. In time, they realized the Japanese were allergic to meat, and the hives were a reaction to this sensitivity. Over the coming decades, Japan saw an increase in meat imports as well as the development of their own domestic slaughter industries. In 1976, the U.S. Meat Export Federation began a marketing campaign to promote U.S. meat in Japan. This was followed up with the 1985 Farm Bill Targeted Export Assistance Program. In 2002, USMEF create the Desire Beef campaign, followed by the We Care campaign. In 2006, the private-public relationship between the USDA and the USMEF has helped to promote meat eating in Japan, generating billions of dollars for the U.S. slaughter industry. Wow. A sign of the current situation is a recent headline from McClatchy, D.C., December 8, 2014, that reads, "Japan's soaring demand for cow tongue drives U.S. exports." Conclusion. The historic account can show us the techniques used in the promotion of meat eating. Number 1, an appeal to religious foreign minority class. Number 2, targeted conversion of the upper classes. Number 3, targeted conversion of the lower classes. Number 4, marketing of meat with whimsical names. Number 5, association of meat with modernity, health, and wealth. Number 6, weapon sales to create political instability. Number 7, threats and acts of war to create free trade. 8, complete destruction and rebuilding a new meat-friendly culture. Number 9, the creation of school lunch programs to teach children meat eating. Number 10, the use of trade associations and economic incentives. The ancient seers understood the subtle laws that guide the universe. The violence inherent in meat shows the seeds of future conflict. When you see these techniques used, know that a pralaya, destruction, awaits. Once Japan was ruled by some of the greatest protectors of the cow, the samurai. Amazing article. This is the Buddha shrine with cows. This is a wonderful picture.